Thank you for joining the 12th webinar of 2014, entitled California Environmental Quality Act, Part 3, CEQAMitigation. We encourage you to become a member of CPF and enjoy the benefits and educational discounts. Information on membership can be found on our website at californiapreservation.org. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. The format for today's webinar will consist of 3 presentations of approximately 20 to 25 minutes each by 3 speakers with unique backgrounds in CEQA. We will close with a 10 to 15 minute question and answer period. There is a Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type it in the box and we will hold the question until it can be addressed by a speaker. There is also a chat box right above the Q&A box, which is visible to all participants and the speakers. If you would like to comment or interject, you may do so through the chat box. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time in the presentation, and this will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. I'm now going to introduce our speakers. Dr. Laura Jones is Director of Heritage Services and University Archaeologist for Stanford University, responsible for stewardship of the university's nearly 100 archaeological sites and 200 historic buildings. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of California at San Diego in 1983 and a master's degree and Doctor of Philosophy from Stanford University. Her archaeological experience includes serving as director of a number of major excavations of prehistoric occupation and cemetery sites in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she works closely with indigenous Muwekma Ohlone tribe. Primary themes in this work include mortuary treatment and subsistence strategies among complex hunter-gatherers. She has also conducted several historical archaeology projects and is currently leading the excavation of the monumental Men's Gymnasium ruin, a site created by the Great Earthquake of 1906. Laura Jones also has a long-term interest in education. She served as Senior Scholar and Director of Community Programs at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching from 2001 to 2006, and is the co-author of a major study of doctoral education, The Formation of Scholars, published in 2007. Stephen Schaefer, also known as Schaef, opened his photography studio in Ventura after receiving his education from the Brooks Institute of Photography in Santa Barbara and the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Schaef is an expert in architectural photography with a practiced understanding of historic structures. He has completed documentary building and engineering surveys for architectural historians, municipalities, and cultural resource management firms. His documentary photographs have been used to nominate sites to the National Register of Historic Places and as CEQA and Section 106 mitigation measures. He specializes in large format 5x7 and 4x5 film photography, adhering to the Secretary of the Interior standards for architectural and engineering documentation. Jeffrey Starnes was most recently the planning manager with Temple City. Previously, he was senior planner at Calabasas, where he was responsible for the creation of the city's historic preservation program and authored the city's historic preservation ordinance. He designated the city's historic preservation. He was the designated city's historic preservation officer and was responsible for the administration and direction of the city's historic preservation activities, including the city's first citywide historic context statement and historic resources survey. He was also the staff liaison to the city's Historic Preservation Commission. Prior to that, he was the associate planner for the city of Ontario for 6 years. While at Ontario, he oversaw the designation of the city's first 5 historic districts and wrote the nomination to place Euclid Avenue on the National Register of Historic Places. Without further ado, we will now begin the presentation with Mr. Starnes. Please hold 1 second while I briefly mute everybody, and we'll begin with Mr. Starnes.
Okay. Today I was asked to really give sort of the planner's view of as you navigate through the CEQA process and looking at historic resources and their impacts. And I know Shafe and Laura will get into more detail on different forms of mitigation. So what I want to start about as we talk about the CEQA process is how do you determine what impacts are? Different ways to help you determine what mitigation is appropriate. And then I'm going to go through just some tips that I always go through, as well as some examples from Calabasas. As we go through, since obviously this is the third of the 3 seminars, just for ease of presentation, just to make some assumptions, we're going to assume the property, we know it is historic. A lot of times with CEQA, that's sort of the first step that people will question, is it really historic? So we'll just assume it is. We're also going to assume that there's some information about why the property is historic, which will help us as we go through in determining impacts. And then finally, we're going to assume that there are impacts. This isn't an exempt project under CEQA. You can't use the restoration and rehabilitation exemption in CEQA. So we're going to assume that there are some impacts involved. First, when you look at how do you determine impacts, there's really 2 different things. One is what's being impacted. Is it simply some character-defining features? It's a mansard roof. It's a stone chimney. There's a specific aspect of a resource that's being impacted, or is it the overall character? For example, if you take a farmhouse that's remnant in the neighborhood and it's on a big lot and it's got trees all around it, and while you're keeping the house but you're going to build 5-story apartments all around it, you're still impacting that resource through its setting and the feeling, etc. And typically that's a much harder area to then mitigate versus an individual character-defining feature. Then second, you really need to look at how does the proposed project retain or affect the integrity of the resource, and really is it looking at what was the integrity beforehand and then what is the integrity after, so that you can really determine how severe the impact is, which will let you, determine what appropriate mitigation is. And as a planner, we all want to know what's sort of the set list of mitigation to use. And after 15 years of doing this, there really is no individual set list. Everybody thinks, okay, you'll document, you'll relocate, there's standard things, but every project is different, and then every impact is different depending on the project. There is no defined set of list of mitigation measures that you can use. Mitigation has to be unique to the individual project, otherwise you end up having mitigation that isn't useful. You're mitigating just so you can say you mitigated, really getting nothing out of it. You're not truly mitigating those impacts. And then finally, all planners think, what if you're demolishing? Well, case law and all the experts say that demolition cannot be mitigated to a level of less than significant. So if you're demolishing a resource, you have to do statement of overriding considerations, and you have to do the EIR. You can't do a mitigated neg deck. The first thing that I do is a project comes in is when do you really start the CEQA process? With historic resources, if at all possible, if you know there's a historic resource, start it the moment the developer comes in and submits the project. If they come in asking questions before they submit the project, start educating them then. It makes your life a whole lot easier when you're then having to get into the CEQA process later. If you don't know when the project's submitted that there is a resource and you find out later, as soon as you find out that there is a resource, start looking at the project and what is going to be impacted by it. Start it right then, even long before you even actually start writing your mitigated neg deck or your EIR or those things. Start as soon as you can. It'll help you later on. You can potentially avoid some impacts if you start early, and projects can be redesigned or tweaked so that you can avoid impacts. Developers, in addition, if you start with them early, they're always looking at it's money and time, and so if they can redesign a project before they submit so that you don't have those impacts, they will, they're obviously saving time and money later. They don't have to do an EIR. They don't have to waste the time of doing an EIR. So all those things are beneficial to them. And in my experience, the earlier you talk to them, the more willing they are to try to change their project if possible so that they can save that time and money later on down the road. Historic contexts are hugely important when it comes to CEQA. Because historic contexts talk about the significant impacts of an area's history, they tell you what's important for an area, as well as what types of resources are important, the characteristics of those resources, all those big picture items that you don't tend to get. A lot of cities inherit an old survey, and there is no historic context. So with just the survey, you're looking at an individual property and you miss the big picture. And so just having that survey limits how you can look at preservation as a whole. And so having all that background data, the context, surveys, all of that combined can give you a much better picture of what a cumulative impact is on an individual project, where you don't get that if you don't have that big picture view. Mitigation options, the common ones that everybody knows about are design-wise. Can you modify the project to protect the resource? I've seen where individual houses become community buildings in a neighborhood, or in an apartment complex. They'll try to reuse the building and put it in the project rather than just demolish it. Documentation, which I know Shafe will talk about. It's the plans and photos of what the resource is, obviously to the HABS, HAIR, and now HALS standards. A lot of people here, you talk about salvaging. Salvaging is tough for a lot of cities because you don't have a place to put the stuff. You're going to salvage windows, you're going to salvage doors, but what do you do with it after? So while it sounds like a good idea in many cities, you're going to a lot of expense and a lot of spending time and effort on something that has no impact at the end. And then finally, with demolition, a lot of people think, oh, we'll just vacate the building, but that has its own issues too, and I believe Shafe's going to talk about those as well. And so as a staff member, I'm always looking not only at those, but try to look at some of the uncommon things that aren't typically done and you don't typically see in a lot of EIRs and MNDs. Other mitigation options, and there is no right answer for any of this, but interpretive exhibits that talk about the history of a place depending on what the project is. You can do oral histories. We had at Ontario, we had a whole dairy preserve that was being changed as the dairies were moving up north, and one of the things that we set out to do was try to get some oral histories of these farmers before they left the area, and so that way we had that record of what the history of the area was, even though we knew that a lot of the area would be redeveloped. We wanted to find out from them what was important to them, what their history was, and it gave us a better idea of what were the historic buildings in that area long before that they were torn down. We did have a couple that projects that came in, and we made them do oral histories as part of their mitigation. Other mitigation options, we've actually, in my experience, have funded historic context and historic surveys in areas so that while we might lose one particular resource, it allowed us to save other resources of the same type. One example is, again, in Ontario, in the Dairy Preserve, they had tons of these Art Deco milking barns. And when the first one came in, we didn't really know what the history was. And so then doing a context of these milking barns and the impact that they had on the whole farming community in their history really helped later on try to save some of those buildings. And then finally, I know a lot of preservationists don't like to talk about it, but there is a financial mitigation that can be done to take the impacts and get some benefit out of losing a building in one place and putting money into saving other historic resources. So that's an option, although it's probably not a preferred one if you can do the other things first. So my tips, as I said before, you need to start early, work with the developers and applicants. It's really, for a lot of developers, it's an education process for them. They buy the property not thinking, oh, there's a historic building on it. And so they come in thinking, I can just tear down a building, and they really can't. If you can avoid the impacts as possible, as I talked about before as well, CEQA is expensive and time-consuming, and that affects the developer's bottom line. And so if working early with them and trying to avoid the impacts, they can save a lot of time and money, and you get a saved historic building out of it. Third, really trying to figure out the difference and what's appropriate to be a mitigation measure versus a condition of approval of the project. Some mitigation measures, monitoring, stuff like that, tend to be easier as a mitigation measure where you can hire out a consultant to do it. But a lot of mitigation measures tend to talk about, not destroying this feature or that. We're really, instead of making it a mitigation measure, change the project beforehand, make those items conditions of approval, change the plans, those type of things. So it's not a mitigation measure later. It's just part of the project that you already did these things. It makes it easier because then you have a set sort of approval process through plan check and construction where it can be better monitored than you can as a mitigation measure. And then finally, really look at who's responsible for monitoring all these mitigation measures. A lot of times that's where sort of the ball gets dropped. You think, okay, we have all these great mitigation measures, we're done. Stuff doesn't get monitored, buildings end up impacted anyway, and really your mitigation isn't useful or helpful. So finally, just a couple examples. This is the picture on here is the Canyon Creek Senior Apartments in Calabasas. And this was actually a project where we had actually gone through the entire CEQA process and sent out all the notices. Didn't know that there were really any historic resources on site. About 3 days before the building permits were to be issued, we got a phone call from the Leonis Adobe Association, which is basically, if you're looking at the picture, there's a shopping center next to this, and then across the street's Leonis Adobe. And they informed us that from their records, they thought that there was a cemetery on site. And we had put in the standard mitigation that if you find something, you had to stop construction and go through all the proper archaeological processes in dealing with human remains. But we never wanted to even get to that point, if at all possible. So we went back and working with the developer and our contract archaeologist who's on staff to really look at how do we figure out what potential area that the cemetery was in, because it wasn't over the entire site, as well as, how do we train everybody to recognize what may or may not be there. Based off the information Leonis Adobe Association gave us, my thought was that the cemetery was actually next door and not on this site. But what we did is we actually spent 4 or 5 hours. We trained the entire grading crew, because obviously there's underground parking, so they were going to be digging up and excavating. Trained the entire grading crew. We trained the entire building inspection staff. We also trained the entire planning staff because we wanted somebody there all the time. We also had an archaeologist was on site, and especially in that area that was the potential for the cemetery being on. And we scheduled the grading, working with the developer and the contractor, to make that area the last to get excavated, so that as we got closer and closer, we could be more focused and really looking at what was there, and how do we deal with it, so that we were really proactive in doing it. Turns out the cemetery wasn't on site; it was next door. But really, your cooperation with the developer, with the construction crew, and with the neighbors, obviously made this project, everything worked out well, and we were making sure that we followed CEQA to the letter. The second example is turns out to be archaeological. This is the Bank of America building. Used to be the Lockheed Martin headquarters in Calabasas and then countrywide. And as Calabasas, because we knew we had more resources underground than we actually had above ground, we had taken the time and effort to figure out all the archaeological studies that had been done in the area through the information centers. And then we had our contract archaeologists actually map them out, so staff knew where things were and what parcels were affected, and then obviously had them coded so that the public didn't know where they were, but and most of the staff, but when something came up, they knew, hey, go see the historic preservation people. And Bank of America had come in and wanted to put in some big emergency generators. A lot of their trading stuff happens here, so they use a lot of energy, and we're afraid with with droughts and heat waves and stuff like that there would be electrical shortages, and they couldn't really shut down their operations. And so when they first came in, we knew ahead of time that there was an archaeological site on this property, and so we worked with them to make sure, one, where they were locating the generators had the least potential impact. We also, working with our archaeologists, looked at the old studies to figure out how deep the resources were, and then worked with the building and safety department to make sure what the requirements were for footings to meet building code. And by working with all three, we were actually able to avoid all the impacts, and therefore we're able to exempt it under CEQA so that we wouldn't have to go through a whole M&D or EIR. We moved the locations of a couple of the generators, modified the footings, so that we were able to do all that, and we didn't impact the resources at all. So those are just a couple examples, and I will turn it back over to John.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to close this slide here and open up Laura's. And if any questions roll in, I'll be sure to queue them for the Q&A period. I will say that Laura will have to leave early, so if anybody has any specific questions for her, I will send you her contact information, but you might also want to ask before she leaves around 55 after the hour. So Laura, you're ready to begin.
Thank you. I'm going to tear off some of the things that Jeffrey had already talked about. We're assuming that you're mitigating because you have a significant resource. I'm going to talk about both historic buildings and archaeological sites. It's really important to link the mitigation requirements to the evaluation. When Jeffrey's talking about how there's no one-size-fits-all, you need to have a mitigation that addresses why the property was significant to begin with. And so you need to know in the evaluation section of your CEQA document what the features are, you call them the character-defining features, that convey the reason that the property is significant. And you also need to know what its period of significance was. The photo on the screen here is the Monterey County Jail, and this is the jail cell where Cesar Chavez was on his hunger strike in 1970, and is one of the reasons why that jail building is significant. So because the building is significant for a particular event and a person, Cesar Chavez, the interior and the character of the building as a jail or as a prison is really important in the preservation and possible adaptive reuse of that building, which is it's actually still under study. The other thing that's important is that you may need to mitigate even if you're not demolishing a building. So you might be adaptively reusing a building in such a way that some of its character is going to be altered. So for example, the Monterey County Jail, it may not be possible to have a financially feasible reuse alternative that keeps the jail cells. In the case of the slide I have here of the Riveter Museum in Richmond, they completely gutted the inside of this old factory building to put the museum in it. So what's important when you're going to have that kind of alteration where some of your character-defining features are lost is that you have the documentation that Shafe is going to talk about later. You're going to do these beautiful photos and all this documentation before you start construction, but you also need to have some provision in the mitigation for documentation during construction because things come up that you didn't expect during a soft demo or site grading or something like that. You want to make sure that the property retains the majority of its essential physical features so that it's recognizable to its period and it has enough integrity, as Jeff was saying, to convey why it's important and to convey its period of significance and why it's significant. And the alterations and additions should be differentiated following the Secretary of the Interior standards. I would encourage you, by the way, to go to rosietheRiveter.org and take a look actually at their fabulous website because they did a lot of different types of interpretation on that project, and they got a CPF award for it. So it's a very good example of how people are able to alter and come up with a reuse, an adaptive reuse of a historic property. And as far as I can tell, they did everything right. Let's go to the next slide. These are just some helpful things to know about and to reference in your either your conditions of approval or your mitigation program that you want the project to comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties if there's an alteration as opposed to a demolition, that you want the people doing the documentation, for example, or monitoring the treatment to meet the appropriate professional standards. So the Secretary of the Interior also has professional qualification standards that you should be aware of for historians and architects and architectural historians and archaeologists. And of course, the Historic American Building Survey that Shafe will talk about later is something, the standards and the requirements for those are things that you can reference in your mitigation and conditions of approval that will make sure that you've got an objective third-party high standard to measure performance against. If you're mitigating for demolition or the loss of significance of a building, so it's altered so much that it's no longer considered a historic resource, that mitigation also needs to be tied to the reasons why the property is significant. So we talked a little bit about documentation. Photographs are most appropriate. They're always appropriate, but they're most appropriate when you have a building or a structure that's significant for its architecture. Interpretation is a really good strategy to use when you have a property that's appropriate, that's significant for its association with a person or event. For example, Cesar Chavez and his hunger strike in 1970 is a good example of that, or the Rosie the Riveter women in the defense industry. They have an enormous amount of interpretation related to that because there are many stories to be told, not just the story of this is an Art Deco building, but a story about what happened in the building. And then I would also say public history. Ideally, you're going to find some way for the public in your community to participate in the interpretation and documentation process. Live, real participation, hands-on participation would be ideal in a mitigation situation where you're demolishing something, because once it's gone, it's gone. It's also really important to consult with your stakeholder communities and local cultural and historical organizations. So here at Stanford, we work really closely with the Palo Alto Historical Association, with the Stanford Historical Society, with the San Mateo County Historical Association, with the Santa Clara Valley Historical Association. So you find out who these groups are, and also the local tribal communities, and what their interests are and what their priorities are. And they should probably be showing up in your public comment period on the EIR. And this is another one of these earlier the better things that Jeffrey was talking about, finding out what they would consider an appropriate approach to documentation or interpretation, and finding out what they think would be appropriate opportunities for public involvement in that would make for a much more successful project. Oral history, Jeff mentioned this. Oral history is a chronically underfunded enterprise that would really benefit from some attention. I have the Rosie the Riveter oral histories are managed by the Regional Oral History Office at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. There's oral history organizations all over the state. Silicon Valley Historical Association has got a big oral history project. So it's possible to imagine both that you might capture some of the stories associated with a property in oral history as a requirement, and then as Jeffrey was talking about, if you're trying to impose some financial mitigation, these are always organizations that are starved for funding, and so as he was talking about with a theme study, you might be able to get funding for more oral histories than just the one person who's associated with a particular property. So you could do, all the living dairy farmers in the valley instead of just one dairy farmer. So I'm a big fan of these oral history projects and local museums, and they are certainly an opportunity for mitigation, particularly when you have projects, as I said, that are properties that are important for their association with people or events in history. Historical markers, interpretive trails, interpretive panels. There are hundreds of examples of these. Once again, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but where there's the opportunity, particularly when you have larger projects or larger redevelopment zones, to link a series of these together to tell stories of an entire period. This is the Rosie the Riveter example again, where they've actually got 8 markers on a trail, and they have 8 different themes. Each one has a different theme. This is obviously more expensive than we're developing one dairy barn approach, but where you really are looking at a neighborhood or a district or a specific plan area, this is a real opportunity to do this kind of work, where you link a series of these markers together and you tell a more complex story. There's 1,000 different ways to build these markers, and you can look those up online, but I think they can be very successful, particularly when they're in public open space or along trails or other places where people actually have time to stop and look at them. So I'm going to talk now briefly, in my few minutes left, about mitigation for archaeological properties. Here's a few phrases that you're going to want to sprinkle in to your documents. The AMDRP, Archaeological Monitoring and Data Recovery Plan. If you have known resources that are going to get impacted by a project, you need to require one of these. So in your EIR or mitigated neg deck or whatever it is, you've identified the properties. There's some phase 1 identification of that. You then need to the project applicant submit, before they get their building permit, their plan for how they're going to treat finds that are made during project construction. This is another earlier is better. You want to clear, in fact, as many of these resources as possible before you're into mass excavation and the construction clock is really ticking. You're also going to want to have an inadvertent discovery plan. This is when Jeffrey's talking about, oh, we've got the standard boilerplate for what happens if we get human remains. Human remains are not the only late discovery item, but you want to have that document already prepared, and your standard consulting archaeologist has got a library of these. It's important to know that you may also need one of these for the renovation of a historic property if it's old enough. So if you're looking at a farmhouse, let's say, that's built before 1920, even if you were looking at saving it and building, something next door, before 1920, most people in California didn't have trash service or indoor plumbing. So you could be looking at important subsurface features like trash pits and privies full of treasure. So you want to make sure your inadvertent discovery plan has got a mechanism for how to recover that information safely, and how to protect the site from vandals and looters, and what to do with that material if you find it. What's your local cultural repository that's going to take that treasure from the archaeologist when they're done. If you've got any potential impact to a Native American sacred site or prehistoric archaeological site, you may want to require a Native American observer as well as the archaeologist. This tends to make things go smoother, particularly when the first of the human remains is discovered on one of these sites, is to actually have the Native American observer as part of your construction and monitoring team. If you're working in an area with a federally recognized tribe, you may want to consider reaching an agreement with the tribe in the form of an MOU or an MOA before you start construction, where you actually know what's going to happen if you hit the site. Otherwise, in my experience, if you don't have a plan and you hit the first Native American burial, you can waste weeks, certainly days and possibly weeks, of just people being angry and making accusations against each other, and the whole scene is very, anytime you're dealing with human remains and heavy equipment, is really ugly. You can anticipate this and plan for it and assign people roles and know what's going to happen next if you start early on that. A couple of other things to know. There are Secretary of the Interior standards for archaeological documentation, and you can reference those as a requirement, that the report submittals need to meet those standards, which are similar in some ways to what Jeffrey's talking about, having historic context. In your archaeological documentation, there does need to be a description of what was found, but there also needs to be some analysis of what we learned from it. Some contribution to our understanding of local history. So that's important. The professional qualification standards for archaeologists are important. And there's another tool for you, which is the Register of Professional Archaeologists, to make sure that that the archaeologists who are handling any particularly sensitive sites, in fact, are qualified to do that, which generally they are. So let's talk just a little bit more. Mitigation for demolition. I really wanted to point out so people understand that archaeological excavation is demolition. So we can only excavate an archaeological site once. Once you've dug it up, you can't put it back. This is a very serious problem, and just hiring a contract archaeologist and writing a report and filing it at the Northwest Information Center, whichever your local clearinghouse is not enough. You need to adopt all feasible mitigation. So you want to think about when you're having one of these situations where you have no alternative but to impact the archaeological site, whether it's a historical site or a prehistoric site, also requiring, in addition to the documentation of the site, some interpretation and some public history. This slide is actually Chinatown, San Jose. One of our Stanford faculty members runs a big public archaeology project down there. It's been hugely popular with families in downtown San Jose. So you're thinking about, it's not just dig it up and file the report, but how is it that we're going to tell the story of this archaeological site and what happened here, and also how can we get the public in our community, are there appropriate opportunities for them to participate in that, either in the archaeological investigation, in the analysis of the artifacts once they're excavated, in the design of the exhibit or the interpretive panel. Where are safe and appropriate ways for the public to actually take some ownership of that? And once again, that wants to be tied to these stakeholder communities. It's very important, and it can be a huge benefit. People love it. They love to bring their kids there. They love to feel connected to that history. And it can turn something that was otherwise sort of bad news into a major community benefit. Okay, I think that's it. I've got just a couple minutes if anybody needs to raise their hand and ask a question. Otherwise, we'll keep going, and John can send you my contact information if you think of something later.
Thank you, Laura. And we did have one question come in, but it wasn't directed to you. We can address it right now, actually, though. The question was for Jeff, and it was, is the Canyon Creek Senior Center treatment actually deferred mitigation?
What? Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Yeah, the question is the Canyon Creek Senior Center Senior Center treatment actually considered deferred mitigation?
I don't know if there's, I guess it's both a yes and a no. It was, the site was never on any record of any kind, and so we had no way of knowing there was even a site there. We put in some standard stuff because it was Old Town Calabasas, and so we knew there's always a possibility. But it wasn't on. It had never been surveyed, explored. Nothing had ever happened on that site, and so we had no way of knowing it was even there. And it wasn't until after we had gone through all the CEQA process that someone said, "Oh, by the way, we think this is here," and it was based off 200-year-old diary that one of the employees kept as part of Leonis Adobe, and so I don't know if it's deferred because we caught it before we started any construction. So I don't know if there's really a good answer to that. Man, maybe Laura knows if technically it's deferred or not. All I know is we were trying to do as much as we could to mitigate it the moment we found out, and luckily it all worked out.
Yeah, I'm not sure what a deferred. To me, it's not deferred because you planned for it and did it as part of the project, right? It's not something that you did as a requirement for something that would happen after the project was built.
Correct.
Right. So I'm not sure. I was a little confused by whether there's an example of what a deferred mitigation is.
No.
But
right, and yeah, go ahead, Shafe.
Technically, mitigations are not supposed to be deferred, so they are tied to the project and tied to its completion and tied to conditions. So the concept of a deferred mitigation is sort of not proper in its very nature, unless you're saying, oh well, the deferred mitigation will be the mitigation that's required if anything ever happens on the property next door. Theoretically, the impact of that property next door, which has the cemetery on it, isn't an impact yet. May never be an impact, so the mitigation will happen when that happens, if there ever is one.
Great, and I had a response that said that it pretty much cleared up her question. So I think, however it ended up, the question was answered, I guess.
Okay.
And I don't see any further questions into the box, but anybody is more than free to type it in either to the chat box or Q&A while Shafe or anybody else is speaking. Given that, Laura, if you need to head out, you're welcome to at this point, and we'll start with Shafe's presentation.
And type into the
Okay,
chat
thank you.
box out there if there's an acronym that we're using that you're not clear on, and we'll clear up that acronym, because I know there's a bunch of acronyms floating around as far as MNDs and HABs and HARES and all that. So I'll go ahead and start. The operative graphic in this show is the balancing bar, the seesaw, and the idea is that mitigations are really a balancing act between the impact and the mitigations. Let's see if we've got... of the wagon wheel in Oxnard, which, as you can see from the photograph, didn't happen. But this was litigation and an appeal, and in writing all of those documents with Susan Brandt-Hawley, who was our lawyer, learned a lot about the CEQA process. And then on the flip side, I'm also a mitigator. So I am the person you call if you have an impact and you need something photographed. And so I'm constantly reading mitigation and monitoring program language in order to figure out how to mitigate a project as it has been spelled out. How many photographs need to be taken, and how and where and what in order to attempt to mitigate something. So I do that for a living, but as an advocate, I'm also involved in trying to advocate and make comments on EIRs. So the basis of environmental mitigation is basically a debit and credit concept. You have impacts on the one side and credits on the other, and they offset each other. So if you look at Wikipedia, all of our favorite location, you can see that there's a whole lot of jargon as far as what environmental mitigation was, but it didn't have anything about history in it, so I just added that, which is the nice thing about Wikipedia.
Hey,
so,
Shafe,
yes?
I just wanted to speak up. A few people are saying they're having a hard time hearing you. I think it may have to do with the distance of your microphone, so if there's any way you could bring that closer, then it might help.
I will adjust. Is that better? All right, so, and I'll talk a little louder. So this Wikipedia entry on environmental mitigations now has a historical component, but the lines that we're really interested in are that projects and programs are mitigated to make them less harsh and less hostile. And we're taking the debits and the credits and we're trying to even them out. So the basis of mitigation also is that it cannot be arbitrary, and there needs to be a nexus. There needs to be a connection between the impact that we are mitigating and the mitigation. The other part of it is they should be roughly proportional. So we don't want trivial and insignificant mitigations, and we also don't want excessive and punitive mitigation. So if we're the mitigations are going to look different if we're removing the first skyscraper in San Francisco versus if we're only impacting a garage in a historic district. And that's something to be very aware of. So who is actually doing the mitigations? And it's the lead agency. So whoever has the authority to require the environmental impact report or the mitigated negative declaration or whatever the environmental document may be, they are the ones that put together the mitigations. And so they are required, and that is who is doing them. However, they are not automatic. They're usually drafted by environmental consultants and planners who are working specifically on this particular environmental documentation. A lot of times, unfortunately, they are the result of copy and paste. Sometimes they are the result of the best practices, but often they're not. And if nobody looks at the mitigations carefully and says, you know, there are other mitigations that would do a better job, or there are additional mitigations that are feasible, then they become final. And bad mitigations happen all the time. And the consultants aren't getting extra points for doing more mitigations. Generally, everybody wants it to be as quick and as painless and as inexpensive as possible. So from an advocacy standpoint, you need to look at mitigations and read the documentation and say, there are other things that can be done in order to make that balance beam a real even system. And so it works when people are informed. How many mitigations? Well, CEQA actually has a substantive mandate, and it requires that all feasible mitigations be undertaken. So even if it does not mitigate to below a level of significance, we want to try to have as much public benefit on the right-hand side through mitigation as possible. And so a lot of times you'll take a look at a mitigation plan and realize there's only one mitigation. And it's usually somebody hasn't really thought about how significant that historic resource is and how to get to a more proper, balanced approach of the credits and the debits. So if you take a typical house and a highway widening project, you're going to have, in this case, in Dinuba, you're going to have an impact to the setbacks of the house, impact to the property, and the setting, the feeling, and the location. And there's a number of different ways you could maybe mitigate that. You could nominate the building to the National Register. You might realign the roadway and avoid the impact altogether. You could do documentation and interpretation, HABs photos. You could monitor carefully the construction and make sure that you're not impacting the quality of the house. You could maybe build a sound wall in front of it, but that might create another impact. So, or you could, what I generally try to avoid and everybody tries to avoid, you could move the house or potentially reposition the house. And if it's just a matter of lifting it up and moving it 20 feet, that might not be the worst approach to it, because having a freeway at your front door might be actually a worse option. And then you get down to the demolition, and as Jeffrey said, a demolition cannot be mitigated. So if you're looking at a demolition of a historic resource in an environmental document, and that's a mitigated negative declaration, which we've seen in Ventura. In fact, we've even had a demolition on a categorical exemption. They do sometimes get plugged into the wrong places. Somebody assumes that we have this impact of the demolition and we can mitigate it and everything will be fine. And so if you see a mitigated negative declaration and there is a demolition involved, be very, very suspicious. So CEQA has actual definitions in the statute for mitigations, and the first two on this list affect the impact. You can avoid the impact, you can minimize the impact. The third, fourth, and fifth, they affect the resource. So, but they don't really fit, and these particular mitigations were never meant to be used for historic resources. So if we use the oak tree analogy, if you have an oak tree and you have to cut it down, and some communities find oak trees extremely valuable, like Thousand Oaks, they have very specific rules about this. You cut one down, you have to plant another 10. In biological terms, that's a lot harder to do with a historic resource, because you could say every historic resource is an endangered species. You can't rip down a building and build another historic resource. You can't paint another cave painting on a new cave. So there are some more practical definitions for mitigating historic resources, and some of them are still the same. The first three affect the impact, which is avoid the impact altogether, or preserve the building and minimize the impact by using the Secretary of the Interior standards, or modify the project so the impact is reduced. And then the other ones are, we can use design, compensation, not so often. We can do monitoring, and then interpretation and documentation, which don't really show up anywhere else in CEQA. So if we talk about avoidance and preservation, using the Secretary of the Interior standards or using them parts of the Secretary of the Interior standards is obviously the best option. And then we move down this list through adaptive reuse, which is also a wonderful approach. We can adapt or modify the plan. We can avoid archaeology, which is the ideal approach when you're dealing with archaeology. Integrating the resource into the project. And then you get down into rehabbing the project after moving a resource, which is not a great option, and then donation and salvage, which is really not a mitigation in my opinion, and it's more of a desperation move. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So for instance, the Secretary of the Interior standards, this is the garment capital building in Los Angeles, and they applied the Secretary of the Interior standards to, in the future, make it into lofts. And the wonderful thing about this is it's that using the Secretary of the Interior standards, your project is considered mitigated. So you've got a get out of CEQA free card if you're going to use the Secretary of the Interior standards. And I've convinced many developers that that's the best approach. Not only that, you have potential historic tax credits. You might be able to use the California Historic Building Code and potentially get Mills Act tax credits. So there's a lot of reasons to try to convince people that sometimes the best approach is to not have an impact at all, and the Secretary of the Interior standard really makes your project exempt from that impact. Adaptive reuse is another option. Here's an old fire department, which adaptively reused into a children's museum. Modifying the project. This is a photograph of the new Museum of Ventura County, and that yellow line at the bottom of the slide is the San Buenaventura Mission Garden Wall, which was found during excavation, the foundation stones. And so the entire project was moved back from that point, which was going to be the front of the museum, so that it could be avoided. So you have avoidance and a modification of the project working there. And then there's also moving. We could move resources. We can move anything. But the big question on this, and this is where I'll get onto my soapbox a little bit, is should we move things? In the city of Minneapolis, the Schubert Theater was moved in 1999. It weighed 8 million pounds. It was the largest building ever moved by mankind. It can be done, but it has a whole bunch of contradictions and issues with it. If you relocate something, it could constitute an impact, or it could mitigate an impact. And so you have to ask yourself the two questions. Is the new location compatible with the original character and use? What's happening with the context? What's happening with the setting? What's happening with the feeling? And two, is the resource retaining its eligibility for listing on the California Register? So I'm going to introduce a new word called repositioning, which will sometimes actually work very well, where you may be moving the building 20 feet or 20 yards or maybe even 100 yards on the same property without removing its context, setting, and feeling. And that might be something that actually mitigates an impact and makes a project more worthwhile. But actually taking a building and moving it out of its property, moving it out of its context, especially moving it out of its jurisdiction, where you now have a different jurisdiction which is responsible for the conditions of the mitigation, is incredibly complicated. So it's just the way it was done in the old days. And preservationists were so successful at moving buildings that the general public, and planners as well, think this is how it's done. In fact, sometimes the very first thing out of a developer's mouth is, hey, we just bought this project, it's got a historic building, where do you want us to move it? And it's really because we've done such a wonderful job of showing people that it can be done, but it really isn't a great way to maintain that history. So in order for it to be successfully moved, you have to ask yourself, is there a relocation plan that meets the Secretary of the Interior standards? Is the project sponsor, do they control an appropriate site for the move? Is there funding for it and the rehab? And is the move and the rehab required for project approval? Or are there conditions placed upon it? It's not really the $1 house move, which is something we want to avoid. And that's that last desperation move. It's like, well, we know we're going to lose the resource. It's going to be burned to the ground. It's going to be demolished. What can we salvage from it? But there really is no public benefit to this, so I would hesitate to call it a mitigation. Design and compatibility is another form of mitigation. You could redesign the project, make it compatible. You could use protective construction barriers and underpinning and shoring and vibration monitoring to monitor adjacency issues. Those are all very viable mitigations that can be added. Design. Well, we don't necessarily want to have too good a redesign. I mean, if we're going to be adding resources, you don't want to necessarily do copycat, but on the other hand, you do want it to be compatible with the neighborhood. So a mitigation may be, look, we're going to require the project to include a preservation professional on the design team because that is going to mitigate the design and make sure it's compatible with the neighborhood. Compensation, which is something that Jeff spoke about, and that's monetary mitigations, or off-site enhancements, preservation funds. They are difficult to accomplish successfully, and here's why. You have to really have a plan in place. Your preservation plan needs to have key consensus. You need to know what you're going to commemorate, what survey, what are you going to spend the money on. And in the end, you get down to that very last line, which is, what is the price to demolish history per square foot? Because somebody will come in and say, look, you know, it's in our best interest to just build this project. So you have this resource and we'd like to demolish it. How much will you charge us? And that's not good preservation. Interpretation plans, they were already discussed a lot, so I'll breeze over those. It works very well for event and association significant. They can be exhibits and public art. I don't believe that on this site once stood, the Otsos plaque really is also a mitigation. Plaques are great for buildings that exist, but they don't really mitigate and make a public benefit for the people who aren't experiencing that building anymore because now it's gone. I really believe these are sort of headstones for dead buildings. So I'm not a fan of plaques except for buildings that still exist. So interpretation is more like very interesting, compelling, hip, using designer and a writer. It's not a 523 form on a stick. It's not boring data. It might have an online component where you could photograph a QR code and get more information, or you can read all of this and see the maps online, which this is a cemetery interpretation in Ventura. And you go online and you see the maps, you can read much more detail, but those kind of interpretations also have to be perpetually hosted and smartphone compatible. So how long are these mitigations going to be up? Documentation, which is something that I do, is basically documenting the resource as much as possible to try to deal with the impact. So why is photography the most common impact? It seems to be the low-hanging fruit on the mitigation tree, and it's that every impact must have a mitigation, and almost everything in the world can be photographed. So this tends to be a catch-all. You can do the photo mitigation. You can do it before the project begins. It's relatively inexpensive. It happens a lot. And it has a mitigating role, but it alone can't mitigate to a less than significant level. And there was a Architectural Heritage Association versus County of Monterey case in 2004. And the judge basically said, as drawing a chalk mark around a dead body is not mitigation, so archival documentation cannot normally reduce destruction of a historic resource to an insignificant level. So generally, if you have a historic resource and it's valuable and it's significant, just documenting it isn't going to mitigate. The other problem, obviously, being that a lot of times that photography and those reports aren't that creative. They are reports, they're put in a 3-ring binder, they're giving to the planning department, and they never go anywhere. So it's wonderful if you can do creative media, whether it's tour guides or oral histories, documentations and films, children's coloring books. the Habs Hair Howells photography, which is the Historic American Building Survey, Historic American Engineering Record, and the Historic American Landscape Survey, those types of photographs often get put on a shelf, and instead of being distributed to all the regional libraries, which is the ideal. There's 3 levels of HABs, 1, 2, and 3, spelled out here. Photo recordation basically means you are creating photo records with negatives. Those negatives have the ability to last 500 years in cold storage, and the photographs can be used by researchers in the future. There's also a specification for measured drawings, which show exactly how the building was built and how it worked. Writing effective mitigation measures really involves finding that nexus that we talked about earlier and figuring out who is responsible and what the conditions will be, specify the deadlines, make sure that it's trackable, and being specific, because we want to create successful mitigations, and clarity creates that. They cannot be deferred to the future, which we talked about briefly, to be done someday after the project is finished. They need to be conditioned. So a lot of ineffective attempts that you may see, whether it's submit for review or hire staff. I always like the one strive to. So we will strive not to demolish another historic theater ever again, which is what happened in Ventura. That's the Mayfair Theater marquee that was demolished on a categorical exemption. So we don't want that to happen. Enforcement. Mitigating conditions are not mere expressions of hope. That was the judge's language in Lincoln Place Tenants versus City of LA. So they must be made fully enforceable, either through conditions or agreements, and that is part of CEQA. That is in the statute. So make sure that they are enforceable and trackable. Mitigations will be found on a mitigation monitoring and reporting plan sheet, which is usually an appendix at the back of the environmental impact report or the environmental impact document. And it'll just spell out, CR1, CR2, which are usually the cultural resource mitigations. It talks about when the action is required, when monitoring will occur, and there's a compliance box to check off. We want to make sure that those things get done properly. Truly effective mitigation involves a public benefit. And both Jeffrey and Laura both spoke about this. If you want to judge how good a mitigation is, you can take a look at it and say, if we as a society have said that the environment is a public benefit and we are adversely impacting the environment, then we need to mitigate that with public benefits. We don't need to create mitigations that end up creating reports or concepts or things that the public will never see or the public will never use. And I think that's a really good way to find out if your mitigation works well. In Manzanar, there's almost nothing left except for foundations, but they've done a wonderful job of interpreting it, and it's definitely a public benefit. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Shafe. I think we only had a few questions come in, and by all means, anybody, if you have questions, just type them into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll make sure they're addressed. The first question that came up was actually in relation to slide 15, which it looks like you're going back to right now.
Yes. Well, rectify is something that is in the CEQA definitions, and I don't really think it fits, so I haven't added it to the practical definitions. If you read CEQA, it's in there. I'm not an expert on that, so maybe Jeffrey can speak to that since he knows the whole of CEQA a little better than I do. But I'm not really sure how you could rectify a historic resource. Good question. Jeff, are you still there?
Okay.
Maybe not. So that didn't help.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I don't know.
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how you rectify a historic resource either. I've never, in over 15 years, never been able to figure out what how you rectify one. Yeah, it's in there. I don't know if that, there's a lot of words in CEQA that make absolutely no sense, and I think that's one of them.
I mean, there may be a way to rectify noise or traffic or biology or hazardous materials or something like that, but I just don't think
Right.
it applies. You can apply it to historic resources. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
The resource is the resource, so you can't. I mean, like you rectify noise impacts. You eliminate the noise. I mean, you can't eliminate the historic resource. So.
And so on the right side, I mean, these practical definitions are 8 concepts that I have tried to split off, but some people say there's only really 3. There's interpretation and documentation and project design. So there is no absolute practical definition for CEQA, which is what makes it so hard, which is why you should be using somebody who is qualified under the Secretary of the Interior standards to help you create these mitigations, so that they really can look at the project. Like Jeff said, every project is going to have different mitigations.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, we have one other question that came in, and this is about the metrics or measuring compensatory mitigation. And do you know of any good examples of measuring or getting metrics for compensation as it relates to mitigation?
I'll turn that over to Jeff. He's the expert.
Thanks. I'm the expert. For everybody out there, I think I'm the only person in the state of California who's ever come up with a mitigation fee by ordinance in the state, and that was at the City of Ontario. We based it. We took our. We have landmarks, you have districts, and we took that level and then broke them out into tiers. And the reason we did the whole mitigation fee is we knew there were properties that if a developer wanted to demolish, council would say yes, and there was no way that council would stop them. And so we decided that we really needed to be able to get something out of a losing situation. And as planners, we could count the votes, and we knew we always had 1 vote, sometimes 2, but we didn't have 3 to stop it. And so what we did was we then looked at all our designated properties and we tiered them. And there were 3 tiers, and where it really helped, and the city manager at the time, it really helped him in dealing with developers later. Those top tier buildings were the ones that we never wanted to see demolished. Those were you are never going to get approval to demolish it. The city manager on down from staff, and he related to the council. These are the most important buildings in town, and no matter what anyone wants to do, we have to keep these. And then so that second tier down was, or as I called it, the first tier was when these will get demolished when hell freezes over. The second tier was, well, hell just has to get a little cold. And then finally the third tier was, it was the 3,000 craftsman bungalows that we had in town. If we lose one, is it overall really affect neighborhoods and those type of things? So, and so we rated them and got our historic commission to rate them. And then from that point, and I don't remember now what the exact fee was, but depending on what tier you were, there was a higher fee. And it was based off building valuation, and then percentages based off the number of criteria you met with that. And so it varied building to building, but we really tried to come up with a set way of figuring out what a fee would be. And it's worked and not worked.
Sorry,
there's been situations where it probably didn't work well. There's others where it really did. They've actually saved some buildings because they were in those upper tiers. The person who's probably the best expert at it is Diana Ayala at the City of Ontario, and she'll probably kill me for giving her name out, but she's probably the best one if you have questions about that individually to call her at the City of Ontario.
So Jeff, you had a lot of these questions answered, though. You knew what you were going to do with the money when it came in, also.
Yeah, when we did it as part of the ordinance, we set up a historic preservation fund, and it was part of the ordinance, and it identified how the money would be spent, who was responsible for determining who got the money, things like that. So that's all written in the ordinance. And they've actually, with some of the money, Ontario's basically historic high school, Chaffey High, the school district was having problems with the seats, and they're just getting beat up over time. And the seats were these great old wood frame seats from the 1930s. And the city gave them a grant to help them restore some of the seats so that they would be protected. Otherwise, the school district was going to tear out everything on the inside, which we didn't want to see. So that's one project that happened. They've given some money to the local museum to do some history exhibits and things like that to really educate the public. So there's been some good that has come out of it. I know the other project that had, and it was in a project basis, there's been a couple, I think. The Ambassador Hotel, I believe, had a financial component, as well as the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. And I don't know how successful they've been, but I know they've had financial components to them.
Okay, and another question is about the impact on setting and feeling and association, and I think you briefly talked about this, Shafe. And the question was about adjacent property. So say there's a project on a property that's non-historic, but it has an impact on the setting or feeling and association of an adjacent property that's historic. What sort of mitigation measures should be put in place in that case?
Well, it's possible you could look at the mitigation and say, is there a way to avoid or change the design of the impact of the building making the impact? Is there a compatibility or a massing issue that could possibly, obviously the best way is to say the new building, if it followed the Secretary of the Interior standards in how it related to the adjacent property, which could be assessed by somebody who is an expert in historic resources, a consultant or somebody like that, then the impact might be mitigated to the point where it doesn't actually exist anymore. That's the ideal. It's like if we follow the Secretary of the Interior standards and we make sure that the massing and the roof pitch and the design and the colors and the setbacks are such that it's dealing with the setting and feeling of the adjacent property in a respectful way, you may end up with no impact, and you may end up with being able to say the whole thing is mitigated. If the project next door is so massive that there are impacts involved, you may want to document the site before this new building is built. You may want to interpret the loss of vegetation or the orchard or the farmland that's being removed, or document that. There's a number of things, but it will be specific to exactly how that adjacency impact happens. And then if the construction is large enough, then you're going to kick in these monitoring, stabilization, ground vibration. There's a proper way to make sure that the buildings that are adjacent are protected and stabilized during construction, that the windows don't get broken and things don't, get they're shored up and there's no trenching problem. So again, it'll be a specific thing, but all of those things will come into play.
And I know some cities have in their, whether it's their historic ordinance or just in their zoning ordinance, will have, instead of making someone go through a variance process to push a building away to avoid the impact, they'll have provisions in their ordinance that say, if you're reducing the impact to a historic resource or eliminating it, that we'll give you the extra height or the less setback without having to go through that variance process, which is much easier to do. And that's another way to really encourage modification design, whether it's the historic resource itself or next door. I've seen a couple projects where they stepped the height on buildings so that it was lower height near the historic resource, and in exchange they gave them height higher than what's normally allowed in the zoning ordinance in order to try to reduce that impact.
Great. And I don't think there are any further questions, but if any come in, please speak now or forever hold your peace. I don't see any at this moment, but what I will do is email all of the registrants at the end of the day with contact information for our speakers in case they have any further questions. And at this point, since there are no further questions that I can see, I'm going to thank all of our speakers, Laura, Stephen, and Jeffrey. What I'm showing right now is a feedback form. Please, we rely on your feedback, and we specifically rely on your suggestions for future topics so that we can plan the following calendar year of program. And I wanted to congratulate everybody on finishing the final part of the three-part series, and also introduce the next series that's coming up, which is a three-part modernism series. The first session will be on the 29th, Tuesday, July 29th, noon to 1:30. To learn more about it, there's a link up at the top of the page. The speaker will be Alan Hess. And also on the links on the top of the page are a number of other resources. There's the sign-in sheet. If you would like to receive your credit, please fill out the sign-in sheet and fax it to us. And thanks again for your time today, and thanks to all the speakers. So please expect the email at the end of the day. And what I'm going to do is end the audio right now, but I will leave this window up for your feedback. So thank you both, Jeff and Shafe, and thank Laura as well, and have a great day.